this module is on the abstract time and how Shakespeare thought about time. That might sound a little boring, but I just want us to think about how we think about time nowadays, and this is weirdly generational. So when I think about time, this is what I think about: my wristwatch, and I check my time on my wrist. Almost certainly you don't have a wristwatch, and you probably check your time on your mobile phone. That means when you get time, you get it together with a text message from your friend, which is to say, you get time in a slightly different unit, together with some other stuff. You get it in a different way from the way I get time. And I get time circular with numbers and with moving hands. And you get time as a flashing digital number. These are different, and these means our concepts will be different. What was Shakespeare's concept of time? And I ask this because whatever play you are looking at, Shakespeare will talk quite a bit about time. It was huge. It's huge for all of us because time is what we live through, and we all know it ends in death. But Shakespeare's time was quite different from ours. He also had a number of different devices to measure time. And I want to look at the devices and then see how this might have affected Shakespeare's thought. So in those days, in Shakespeare's period, the best way to tell the time indoors was with an hourglass. I happen to have one here. This is an hourglass. Here it is. I'm going to turn it, and you can see the sand starts running into the lower bulb. And when it's run for an hour, the sand will have gone all the way through. Think of that as an abstract. When you look at this, it's going to be very hard to tell a minute. You can't really tell a minute. You can't really tell half an hour. In fact, the only unit of time you can tell is an hour, near the beginning of an hour, near the end of an hour. Nevertheless, when you think of time in terms of an hourglass, there's something that's very clear to you, and that is that the sand will run out and then time will stop until you turn the glass again. So, when you think about an hourglass, you think about the stoppable nature of time. That makes you think about death. If you look at really old gravestones, you'll see that they have hourglasses on them very often. If you see depictions of the character of death, he very often holds an hourglass. So, who does Shakespeare have using or holding hourglasses? Well, in The Winter's Tale, he has the character Time, who comes on with an hourglass and turns the hourglass in order to move the play forward by 16 years. But he also has an hourglass, quite interestingly, in The Tempest. And if any of you know any Latin, tempest comes from tempestus, meaning storm, but also tempus, meaning time. So that's quite a timey play. And throughout the play, people are measuring time in that play by the glass. They say that the events happened 3 hours since, for instance, 3 glasses since. They're measuring the play by the hourglass, and that play happens in real time. The story takes place over 4 hours, and the play takes about 4 hours to perform. And that's one of Shakespeare's only plays that actually does that puts the audience in real time. And it keeps reminding us of that by reminding us of the hourglass. And that will also remind us that it will stop soon, and that there's a kind of, will give a kind of sorrow to that play. Also think of some of Shakespeare's vocabulary. Whenever he says something like time runs, he's thinking of an hourglass because the sand runs. It seems to go very fast in an hourglass. So that's one form of time for Shakespeare. But now let's switch instruments. If you were not indoors but outdoors, you wouldn't use an hourglass. Instead, you would use a sundial. And a sundial was very magical to you because a sundial, I'll show you a little portable one. They had portable sundials, and I'm going to show you 2 actually. This is one form, this is a reproduction obviously of a portable sundial. You see how small it is? Then you open it up like this. On the bottom half, there's a compass so that you can stand in the right direction. And this little string here will throw a shadow, and the shadow will tell you the time. And here's another kind of portable sundial. This is called a ring dial. This has a little hole in it. You point the hole at the sun. It's got numbers inside, and they will tell you the time. If you're finding out time from a sundial, you're thinking of time in a completely different way, because a sundial uses shadow to reveal what's happening in the sky. So it's already like a metaphor. It's already revealing something about light through shadow. But a sundial also appears to be giving you the time directly from God. An hourglass can be terribly wrong. It can be very, very inaccurate, particularly in those days where the damp would get in and the sand would clump and the bulbs would be they wouldn't quite match one another. But a sundial was always accurate. So sundial time is completely accurate, comes from God, works through the medium of shadow, but is sort of wayward the way God is. Because if the sun goes in, if it's night, but also in England, if it's practically any season, to be frank, half the time you can't actually tell what the real time is because the sun is hidden. So Shakespeare has sundials in a number of plays. One is As You Like It, where Jaques says that he sees Touchstone draw a dial from his poke. A poke means a pocket. He'll have drawn one of these because this is called a poke dial, a ring or a poke dial or a pocket dial. So he draws a dial from his poke, and then he looks at it and he concludes that hour by hour we ripe and ripe, and hour by hour we rot and rot like fruit. And so he sees that people die like fruit. He's obviously thinking of the sort of natural world, because a sundial makes you think of sun and nature. But when Shakespeare thinks of the abstract time, sometimes he also thinks of a sundial. So when he says that time creeps, or is like a thief, or is stealthy, that's what he's talking about. Even if he's not mentioning it, he's thinking about a sundial. It's not running as it did in an hourglass. Then there's a third type of clock, and that is our kind of clock, a clock. But clocks in those days were a bit different from ours. They didn't have a minute hand. They only had an hour hand. So we've already seen that you couldn't tell a minute from a sundial. You can't tell a minute from a sundial. You can't from an hourglass. You couldn't from a clock either. A minute was just too small a unit of time to come up with. So when Shakespeare does talk about a minute, and he does, he's never experienced a minute. And in fact, minute is the same word as minute. And when Shakespeare talks about a minute, he probably means a second, the smallest kind of time you can come up with, really, really tiny. So a clock is the third way you could tell the time, but clocks were really, really inaccurate because clocks in those days, they worked on clockwork, but no one had invented a regulator yet. So when you wound up your clock, it would start unwinding really fast, and it would be too fast. And then as the day went on, it would become too slow. So clocks were really inaccurate. And when you had a clock, you had to have a sundial as well, so that whenever the sun shone, you could correct the clock. However, a clock makes you think of the abstract of time in a different way again. A clock is circular, so time goes on and on. It doesn't stop. It isn't intermittent as with a sundial. It doesn't cease as with an hourglass. A clock suggests eternity. And also because in a clock, after 12, you go back to 1 again. You can always restart. It also suggests things like the resurrection. So when Shakespeare uses a clock, it's often in a very positive sense, or in a naughty sense. The bawdy hand of the dial is upon the prick of noon, is as naughty as it sounds, prick meaning prick. So Shakespeare could be quite thought about time in different ways, depending on the instrument he was thinking of time through. And sometimes he plays games with all of that. There is an interesting moment at the end of Richard III, when Richard III is waking up for battle, and Richmond is waking up for battle. And Richmond wakes up in good time and is completely happy. And Richard III asks for a watch to be put by his bed. And a watch was a quite a big but a personal clock, quite a poor one as well. He asks for a watch to be set there, but it doesn't wake him up. Then the cock crow doesn't wake him up, so natural time doesn't wake him up. Then when he does wake up, he realizes he's overslept and he's sort of discombobulated and he's nervous. And so he says, you know, who's heard the clock strike? Where's the sun? Why isn't the sun shining? What's the time by the sun? And you can see that he's rotating through the different instruments of time and they're all eluding him. And then you as an audience realize, gosh, all forms of time are leaving Richard. He's no longer in control of them. Whereas good Richmond, time is working out for him. I think I can guess how this battle is going to go. But as I say, you can also see that Shakespeare is using the literal and the metaphorical properties of those different instruments of time. But what interests me quite a lot is that Shakespeare is also thinking personally about time in different ways, depending which instrument he's thinking of it through. So when in your play, Shakespeare says time at some point, you say to yourself, yes, but which instrument is he talking about and why?